Thanks for inviting me. And I'll say, first of all, I am not a mathematician for my sins. I do an awful lot of stats and quants, but I wouldn't ever put myself in your territory. But I'll talk briefly about a project that I started at Southampton in 2015. It went on till 2020. So it went on for 5 years. Having been a Pro-Vice-Chancellor in a university in Australia, I will also start by saying that partnership is a very contested idea. It's actually quite problematic for many. It depends on people's conceptions of what learning is, and also about the relationship between different parties in that partnership. It brings up lots of different viewpoints. Vesna quite rightly corrected, as you mentioned, about the lack of work in mathematics. Up to about a few years ago, the quality of the work on students as partners from a research perspective was relatively poor, I will say. So that has impacted its take-up as well, because a lot of the work has not been research informed. The project we did at Southampton, which Vesna was very much part of for her sins, and she still has the bruises and scars of being involved in that project, but it was the only one of the Office for Students 17 multi-million projects that actually had a proper methodology and evaluation process embedded in it, which I think is actually an important point to make. So if we move on to the next slide, Vesna, and have a look at it. So I've put there, I started off by looking about how students come to co-own their programmes. And what does that actually mean? And one of my colleagues says, we don't confer ownership on anybody. We don't have that gift. And it is a complex one about how we invite students in, what their role is, and what the extent of that role is, honestly, as well. But there is an argument, unless you pull students in to being involved in what I call the back room of all the work you do in curriculum, they're never going to be able to have the level of engagement to step up to the highest levels of understanding that we would want them to have. So we do need to let them into that back room. I developed an assessment framework, particularly I called it EAT, Equity, Agency and Transparency, which was very much about really having those debates about, in every step of the process of teaching, how do we engage with students? And I was very much informed by work I'd done in medicine, and also work I'd done in Hong Kong, where students were very much involved in actively marketing their programs, recruiting students to programs, tutoring and mentoring. And they really were leading their programs. And I thought this is important to capture how we do that. All of my resources are available on my inclusivehe.org website. So you can go in there and get them. This one will be available to you. Well, I'll just mention that now in case you wanted to go and look up some of these things later. Next slide, please, Vesna. Okay, so why should we bother with students as partners? And I'll just summarize quite a large body of research that is robust, very, very simply, and say, yes, it does impact attainment, but it has to be the right type of engagement. So there's always a caveat, isn't there? And the thing about that notion of ownership and engaging students, it links very much with Ryan and Decky's work on self-determination, about the need for every individual to feel autonomous. Sometimes in higher education, we don't feel very autonomous at all at the moment. But it's about that notion of belonging, well-being, and power over what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. And one of the biggest factors impacting student outcomes, apart from prior academic ability, I'm afraid, is self-efficacy, one's belief that one actually can do well. And this is not just a problem for students, it's a massive problem for academics. And I don't know if any of you would hold your hands up to that as well, in terms of, do you feel that you have the ability to do well? Having worked in different sectors, the number of knockbacks in higher education is actually quite colossal. And in certain disciplines where you've only got a 5% chance of getting research bid through, if you're more in the humanities focus, you really are kind of, the odds are stacked way against you, to be extreme. So I then talked about what types of engagement do we really want to look at, and I talk a lot about self-regulation, and for me that's, do I know what's required of a particular task? Do I know how to go about it? do I know how to be successful in it? That isn't about working hard all the time, folks. That may not be a very efficient use of your time. There was a very good meta-analysis back in 2017-18 by Schneider and Preckle. And they basically said that the students who did best were the most discerning. And that means discerning where you bother, which might go against what we want to see from students sometimes, but knowing when to engage and knowing when not to, which might cause problems when we're talking about collaborative working. So if I'm a student who thinks I'm not going to get anything from engaging with X, Y, and Z in this activity, why should I bother? But then what's my responsibility to the group? And also, how does that relate to the learning outcomes we've established for that particular module? So it's quite complicated, and it depends on the profession as well. But I think there's some interesting things in there to look at. I'm going to talk now briefly a little bit about the assessment framework, not too much, because I'd like to pick up some of the more cogent issues that have arisen from doing that work rather than the work itself. And we did validate an assessment engagement scale from the work on the framework, and it's just been accepted. Actually got really good feedback from this journal, so I giggle sometimes because my work's all about assessment and feedback, and the number of times the feedback I get is pretty interesting to put up there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, initial, if you want to go back to look at the origins of the work, I'm just giving you breadcrumbs at the moment. So if you go to, I've put the link up there, the file link to Making Sense of Assessment in Higher Education is where I started this work. And basically I started looking at students coming into a university and Russell Group universities and looking at, could we identify at point of entry which students would be successful and which students would not? And a lot of it, to ruin the end message, is dependent on the networks that students forge and the connections they make and who they rely on. So if you, I mean, I was a geographer in one of my many previous lives, and if you did a network analysis of the nature of links students have and the quality of them, you could probably do a very good prediction about outcomes. And a lot of this is how they choose to relate with each other, how they relate to students, and how do we work through that. I called it the feedback landscape, and navigating it is interesting. And I looked at all the individual factors that impact how students engage. And this could apply to academics as well. I'm not going to go into the depths of it, but if you're interested to look at that notion of the relationship between an academic and a student, there's a whole piece in this article in Making Sense of Assessment and Feedback in Higher Education. It's free to download from that link, but it actually talks about what that nature of that relationship needs to be from the research to be able to be successful. And it's quite telling because that was written 10 years ago and it's still an issue today. That long time ago. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just a couple of things. If we're talking about partnership, I'm going to mention three kind of core concepts in this that I think are really important. Very briefly. So one is the notion of agentic engagement. And I think this is absolutely essential when you talk about partnership. So basically, this is, to what extent do I feel that I have the capacity to change the learning environment to make it work better for me? And some of them, I call them savvy feedback seekers, students who can do this, nail assessment. So if it's not working well for them, they know how to leverage, they have the political literacy skills, they know how to connect, or they know how to find affordances in environments where they actually don't exist. They go out and find the support, but also they leverage change. They leverage change in the conditions of their learning to work for them. They are very clever. We can train students to do that. It is conflicting. If you're not a confident lecturer, that might be a challenge too far. So we need to work on lecturers' confidence if we're going to do that. So I talked about it, the ability to use the environment well to enhance your learning and actually the learning of others as well. It's not just about the self. Talk a lot about self-regulation. This is, again, understanding what strategies and skills I need to use in any context, and how I manage those cognitively and also effectively. I mentioned a little bit about emotions indirectly there, but it's really knowing what I talk about, do I know what strategy to use and do I know how to use it well? And students who often don't do well do not pick up what we call cues in the environment that are kind of like indicators of things they need to do or not need to do. They seem mute to taking up these ideas that they're not getting them. They're not picking up the advice you're giving them. They're missing it. They're missing a beat. It's like they're disconnecting. The other one is, I talk a lot about assessment literacy. It's really understanding the gameplay within a discipline and what it is to think, act, and be in a discipline. And we need to spell that out, and we need to induct students in what it is to be a mathematician, what it is to be a geographer, what it is. What are those key ways of thinking that are prized, or where are those different continuums? I was a human geographer and a physical geographer. There were massive battles between human geography and physical geography. In some universities, they're in completely different faculties. They are worlds apart. I was always trying to bring those two different worlds together. And I think it's fascinating, those different debates that one has. If we move to the next slide, Vesna. Okay, this is a bit of an overkill for you. So it is available, all the stuff on the framework. And basically, I'm not going to go through it, but I'm just going to pick up. If you looked at assessment feedback, there are 12 factors that affect the effectiveness of what you do as a lecturer. This is a student version, there's a lecturer version. So there are things we can do to encourage students' understanding of requirements of assessment, which are in purple. There are things we can do to support students' feedback capacity. And there are things we can do in how we design to maximize students' access to what we're doing. I'll just mention a couple of things about that. The big one is there about student and staff entitlement. What's the role of the student from the get-go? How do I want students to step up? And can I do it from the point they walk into university or even before? And we need to do it early. Again, one of the big problems around feedback is it's seen as a receipt model still, whereas it should really be mainly about students seeking and utilizing and giving feedback for themselves. The whole chat GPT, which I always say the wrong way around, is a model based on constant comparison. It gets more intelligent by the millisecond because it's constantly comparing everything that's out there. That's what we want students to be able to do, that act of constant comparison, that internal regulation. How do I inherently know that this piece of work is better than that piece of work? This coding is more correct than another. How do I do that? And I only do that by the act of getting underneath, constantly comparing. And do we give multiple opportunities for students to be able to do that? And in actual fact, the assessments that we set, do they actually give students agency over producing something that has value beyond an assessment point? Because if it doesn't, what a limited amount of effort for what you're going to get from it. So I always want assessments to be able to help the student beyond the assessment point, get them into a career, and also to help society. So how can we set assessments that have value added to them for the individual and for the organization beyond testing where they sit on a continuum, which is ever so important, yes, but it can go further. I'm not going to go round this framework. I can come back to it and talk to it if anybody wants to, but the focus really is more, as Vesna has asked me to look at, the whole partnership concept. So I'm going to say, we developed the whole notion of student engagement in all of those things through using this framework, and it was incredibly powerful. We also found that by measuring students' engagement on a scale of 1 to 5, 1, I don't get out of bed, 5, I'm all over it, and students' perceptions of that, there were links with outcomes, not in all programs because it depends on how it was implemented, but it was really interesting that there were quite strong markers. And also we looked at student and lecturer versions of the diagram that was produced. If I go to the next slide, and you could lay on multiple profiles of a whole group and individuals, and staff's perception of the extent to which their curriculum allowed students to engage was often far removed from students' perception of the extent to which they could engage. So on that diagram, 4 means I'm pretty much all over it. A 5, and as I said, a 0 or a 1 is I haven't got out of bed, or I'm in the room but the lights are just not on. I'm somewhere completely else, and we've noticed that one. If I move to the next slide and just pick up some of the points that became, what's very interesting, we looked at lots of tools to support colleagues in looking at what approach did they use in terms of, I kind of called it transactional, in terms of giving, receipt model, a gift to a student, and the transformational in terms of the student acquiring that knowledge for themselves, and students generating the examples and the work. And in some places, transactional is the right move, and it often is. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not like it's evil. It's a bit like someday, years and years ago, people said, well, calculators are evil, or PowerPoint is evil, or ChatGPT is evil. No, it's not. It has its place. But it's, okay, how do we move to a position where we're engaging students in co-construction, and how do we train them to be able to do that meaningfully? And there's a lot of steps in doing that, in terms of working with students to observe the skills they need, giving students opportunities to emulate what they've observed, giving students opportunity to lead, and then really testing whether they can take the concept and apply it to new contexts and actually evolve our way of thinking and involve the way that we design. We developed a whole self-regulatory network of framework of skills, which I, again, have put at the bottom of this slide. If we move to the next one, Vesna. I'm just going to quickly talk, because I think this is quite important to talk to, because people will probably saying in the chat, and I will come back and answer the chat once I've stopped talking. But there's always lots of buts. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to just talk to you about some barriers to co-creation. So, okay, what we've discovered, and I do feel ancient now, I feel like I'm geriatric. What I've discovered over the last few years is that students have, and again, it might be just in the, I mean, I have worked across all disciplines, but I found students have become increasingly mute. In maths, when we went into Vesna sessions, students were quite terrified about the test questions, what assessments they were going to have on a weekly basis. That was most on their mind whenever we did spot checks about what you're most worried about. And so student confidence is quite low in many respects. So students are often coming into higher education quite long, and I'm not even going to mention the C word here about the impacts of that, but they're there. But it's the ability of students to be able to step up to the plate, the fear of being stupid, the fear of being found out, the fear of not being capable, how one is perceived by colleagues and peers. It's terrifying for many students. I remember one lecture, I don't know if Vesna was at it, I actually lied down on the floor in the lecture theatre and refused to speak until students actually took control of the conversation. It was a good sleep for me, because they took an awful long time to actually rise to the debate, but I was not getting up, so I had a lovely sleep all afternoon, because I said we have to get to the crux of this. What is so terrifying about saying you don't understand? What is so terrifying about getting it wrong? But it's a massive issue, and one can't underestimate it or belittle it. It's massive, and it needs to be tackled. It's an elephant in the room. Students come in with varying levels of ability. So again, we talk about equality of voice. Would you give equality of voice in a group to somebody who knows nothing? So that's a challenge there. How do you use the voices in the room, and how do you upskill individuals to have that knowledge? And there's a willingness. Again, students have many conceptions, like academics, that it's not their role to be involved in the delivery. It's the lecturer's role, and that's not part of teaching. So that's a conception. that has to be tackled head on from the get-go. So you need to pull them in from the get-go. We also found if you waited 6 or 7 weeks to have those conversations about engagement, too late. You've lost your window. So it needs to be done at point of entry. It's really important. From the lecturer, that notion of what enabling design looks like. Why would I expect lots of academics across physics, chemistry, whatever, to be trained in co-creation and dialogic exchange to the way that some might find it more natural in a particular discipline? And I'm not making judgments, I'm just trying to raise the issue. I'm not saying it's particularly about those disciplines at all. I just raised them out of my head. Confidence of lecturers is massive. A lot of lecturers lack confidence. They need to see it being done and they need support in that space. And especially when it goes wrong. So who takes the responsibility if we want to go down those lines? And it's about the quality of professional development, which again, I'm probably not a fan of lots of people because I argue that a lot of the professional development quality is often low and not subject specific enough to be able to apply it at a discipline level. And that needs to up its game significantly, and it needs to draw on research, which it doesn't sufficiently, in my opinion. So I've put there are things about conceptions of what we think the role of each of us is. Mindsets about roles are really quite intransigent in some. A lot of it is about confidence and belief in ability. And if you've never been involved in that co-creation, you have to take baby steps. So some can make big leaps, some can make baby steps. So we have to think about that very, very carefully and what that is and how we train students in doing that effectively. If I move to the penultimate slide, when we looked at academics' perspectives, and we've been doing Erasmus work across many countries in Europe and the UK around some of the key issues that face academics in terms of those barriers around co-creation. And I think that's quite important to think about. So how valuable it is. A lot of academics will say to me, across different disciplines, I can't do this because it's not in my remit. And I'm saying you don't need to change regulations. This isn't about your learning outcomes. It's not around the overall field. It could be, but it's not. But you do have the control within your own delivery to engage students more in co-creation. But if you're a pioneer species, I'm going back to biology now, if I'm fighting on the coast like a piece of marrow grass, which I'm going to get attacked, and I thrive by it, you're on your own initially if you're the only module in a program that is really asking students to step up. You've got a hard graft because you need that consensus across the program. You need allies. The strength of the project at Southampton was we created a community of over 1,000, and at Griffith in Australia I created a community of 4,000. When you create a community across a university, you give moral support and you also translate ideas across disciplines, and it empowers individuals to be able to do that, and it also supports you when things don't work. But you need a senior leader in an institution to take the ruck and support you. If they're asking you to do something, they need to put in place the supports when things don't quite go to plan. A lot of staff, we tested this at Southampton years ago, didn't understand. I think 48% of staff got all our quizzes wrong on what the assessment regulations were. Some aspect of, not all, but there was quite a high error rate about staff understanding of what their own assessment regulations were. Do try the test in your own discipline. It's absolutely fascinating what people think the rules are and what they are. I think knowing academic policy and regulations is a great freer of the soul, because once you know, you can really take off. But I also used to encourage colleagues to challenge regulations because they're there to be challenged. And if we need to evolve regulations, we really need to be able to do that. If people have a convincing case, we need to move it on. We showed during the C word that you can change things quite rapidly if you have a strong evidence base to allow it. So let's go with that. Training and co-creation is absolutely essential, and we really need to tackle the role of students within assessment, etc. I've mentioned their willingness to discuss the complexities and things that are not right in what we do, a really important part of co-creation. One of my students said, I knew we had made it when you turned around to us and said, Houston, we have a problem. I'm not quite sure how we nail this. And they said, you actually brought us into a complex problem. We didn't go down a litigious route. We actually looked at, it's our program. As soon as you move students to saying, we have a problem, how do we solve it? You've won. Because they're seeing it as their program. We're working on it together. I used to say, if this doesn't work, 50% of it is the student's issue and 50% is me, because I can't force students to do X, Y, and Z. That's their volition. They need to buy into it and they need to play their part. But that comes into establishing what those boundaries of control are and what the limits are and what they can advise on and what they actually can't. What's black and white that can't be changed, and what is grey? Where's the grey matter in all of this that we could actually play around with? And there's a lot of it. I think there's also that kind of baseline of expectation of students about expecting to engage. I remember once I sent away a whole gang of consultants in medicine because they hadn't stepped up and done the prep work for a session I was running with them. And we're actually behaving like 7-year-olds. They haven't done the work because I was busy in an operation. I went, yeah, okay, but you signed up to do this. You come with the goods, or we don't have the discussion because I can't do it on my own. It requires you to step up. So it also is about being quite tough on that. It also requires both academics and students to be tolerant of uncertainty. And some individuals cognitively, from my psychology background, will have a greater toleration of uncertainty than others. Toleration of uncertainty can get you into serious trouble, by the way, in life, but it also gives you lots of opportunities. And then it's going back to demands on one's time. Initially, really engaging in partnership is time consuming, but once you've got it, you actually save eons amounts of time. So the payback is phenomenal and the outcomes are great, but there may be stumbling blocks along the way. I'm not going to call it a smooth direction. There is a lot of fear of failure, so it does require senior leadership and program leadership to step up to the plate and take the responsibility for getting staff over the line in this area. And then I think my last slide will be very much now. And again, from my own background is going back to base, how are we ensuring that what we're asking students to do, it enables the production of something meaningful? I use the word product. Some people hate the word product, but how is it worth them getting out of bed to do in the first place? And if I'm a high self-regulating student, do I really need to test a problem 25 million times when I got it after the first go? That's just cruel and unnecessary, but other students might need that. And that's where things like ChatGPT can be very helpful, and AI more broadly in terms of adaptive learning and support for students. I'm going to stop there and open it to questions. I don't know, over back to you, Vesna. So I hope I've covered what you wanted me to cover in that space.
Yes, thank you, Carol. So if there are just very few questions, we are again chasing the time. I will now stop sharing. And sorry, we had anything in chat?
Yeah, there's currently no questions in the chat. I'm sure Carol will keep an eye, so if you do come up with any while listening to other talks, please do drop them in. But for now, just some comments in the chat.